Today's mindful moment. Imagine a book so powerful, it's shaped entire civilizations, inspired millions, but its meaning. That's been constantly debated, reinterpreted, really for millennia. We looked at some material focusing on the biography of this incredible book, the Bible, and wow, there's some really surprising twists in its story.
Absolutely. And this isn't just about, religious doctrine or rules. We're talking about how it evolved from just scrolls into what we call scripture today.
Right, and how the stories were understood so differently across the centuries.
Exactly. And how it's still, even now, a source of profound inspiration, but also sometimes intense conflict.
The material you sent gives such a fascinating lens on this. Our goal today is really to highlight some key shifts, some really major changes in how the Bible's been read and understood over time.
Okay, so where should we start? Maybe with the early interpretations, because it seems, maybe counterintuitively for us today, that literal readings weren't the norm for a very long time.
Yeah, that's striking. The sources say until the 19th century, a purely literal interpretation was actually rare. For centuries, both Jewish and Christian thinkers preferred allegorical, even quite inventive interpretations.
Inventive is right. They mention rewriting biblical history, replacing stories with new myths almost. It wasn't about getting a precise historical record, as we might think of it now.
What was the purpose then, if not historical accuracy?
Well, it seems the main goal was practical, spiritual, and moral application. It was about how the text guided your life, your rituals, your ethics.
I remember reading this line. The truth of Scripture cannot be assessed unless it is ritually or ethically put into practice. That really hits home. The value is in the doing, in how it shaped you.
Precisely. It's a very different mindset. And, the texts themselves didn't just appear fully formed. Their creation was a gradual process, too.
Right. Those early scrolls taken from Jerusalem to Babylon, they were studied, edited, sure, but not seen as totally untouchable at first.
Not initially, no. Scribes felt, surprisingly free to add things, alter passages, adapt them to new situations.
That really contrasts with later ideas, or even some ancient Near Eastern myths, of perfect tablets descending from heaven. These Judean scrolls were treated more like living documents.
Something like that, more like an archive reflecting their journey. And you can see influences from neighboring cultures seeping into, ideas about kingship or covenants.
And then literacy starts to spread more widely around the 8th century BCE. That must have been a huge factor.
Oh, definitely. That's when we see the writing down and combining of older oral traditions into what would become the early parts of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books, essentially crafting their national saga.
But even as these texts became more revered, people were still changing them. There wasn't a fixed Bible yet.
No, not a fixed canon as we know it. Alterations happened. They were deeply important texts, embodying identity and hope, but not yet sealed, Then comes a major crisis, the Babylonian exile.
Ah, yes. A really devastating time. It sounds like it forced a complete reevaluation of their relationship with God in these texts.
It did. The hopes of the Deuteronomists, people who thought Josiah's reforms would usher in a glorious era, were just dashed. Josiah dies. Babylon conquers Jerusalem.
Jeremiah had warned them, hadn't he? Against defying Babylon.
He had. And his words must have seemed chillingly prophetic when Jerusalem and the temple were destroyed in 586 BCE.
And it's out of this trauma, this exile, that we get a specific version of the Genesis creation story.
Yes, the P version, the priestly version.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just history. Creation stories back then often served a therapeutic purpose, recited in times of need for renewal.
So for the exiles, it was comforting. A way to contrast their god, Yahweh, with the powerful Babylonian god, Marduk.
Exactly. And notice how non-violent this creation is. Unlike other myths with battling gods, here God just speaks. Word by word, the world comes into being, and after each step, God sees that it's tough, it's good.
That's a powerful message of order and inherent goodness for people living in chaos and loss. Just speaking things into existence.
A very different kind of power. But then the return from exile brings its own issues. Ezra comes onto the scene.
Ezra. He seems to represent a move towards, maybe a stricter approach.
Definitely a stricter, more exclusive definition of the community. He was sent by the Persians to ensure Jewish law was followed, and he was apparently appalled to find widespread marriage with non-Jewish women.
And his reaction was quite public, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Tearing his clothes, mourning, leading to a strict enforcement of the Torah.
Very strict. He basically forces the community to choose, follow Torah, including sending away foreign wives and children, or face expulsion and loss of property.
So membership in Israel gets tightly linked to Torah observance. That creates a clear identity, which might be needed after exile, but there's a potential downside.
Yes, the sources point out this kind of scriptural focus carries a risk. It can lead to an orthodoxy that's exclusionary, maybe even harsh. It raises timeless questions about defining community.
And this focus on interpreting Scripture continues to evolve. What about Daniel during the Maccabean Wars?
Daniel's approach is fascinating. He's looking at Jeremiah's prophecy about 70 years of desolation, but he's not trying to figure out Jeremiah's original meaning concerning Babylon.
He's reapplying it
You
to his own time.
Exactly. He performs inspired exegesis, seeking a new meaning in the old words to give hope to Jews suffering under Antiochus Epiphanes centuries later. The text speaks to the present and future.
So Torah study itself becomes almost a prophetic act, seeking new revelations within the existing text.
In a way, yes. Interpreters would purify themselves, practice asceticism, trying to become receptive to these deeper insights hidden in the words. Daniel finds his visionary initiation in the text.
The text itself becoming the source of ongoing revelation. And the Qumran community, the Dead Sea Scrolls people, they took that even further.
Oh, much further. They believed they alone understood the scriptures, that their leader, the teacher of righteousness, had unlocked hidden things meant specifically for them.
Their Pesher interpretation saw everything, every word, pointing directly to their community and the imminent end times. Very inward-looking.
Very. But it shows the diversity. Around the same late Second Temple period, you had others rewriting older texts, too, like Enoch or Jubilees.
Why rewrite? Were they uncomfortable with parts of the older stories?
It seems so. Maybe troubled by God commanding Abraham to sacrifice Isaac or by the violence of the flood story. So they subtly retold them, sometimes blaming difficulties on figures like Satan or Mesema in Jubilees, rather than God directly.
Interesting. A way of wrestling with tradition? And then, of course, the Jesus movement emerges.
Right. His followers saw his resurrection as the start of the end times, the coming kingdom. And they began reading the existing Hebrew scriptures through that lens, seeing him as the awaited Christos, the Messiah.
At the same time, over in Alexandria, you have Philo doing something completely different.
Completely. Philo, steeped in Greek philosophy, particularly Plato, uses allegory. He wants to translate these Semitic narratives into a Greek philosophical framework.
So Adam becomes reason. Israel becomes the soul. Moses is wisdom.
Exactly. He called it hyponoia, deeper meaning. The goal was to find the underlying philosophical or spiritual truth that could, transform the reader. Cain and Abel become a story about self-love versus love of God.
It's amazing how many different ways people were reading the same core texts. Philo also made that distinction about God, didn't he? Between God's unknowable essence, the ousia, and his knowable actions or powers, the energei.
Yes, including the logos, the divine reason active in the world. A crucial distinction for bridging Hebrew thought and Greek philosophy.
But this period of flourishing interpretation runs headlong into another catastrophe, the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE.
A watershed moment. The Roman destruction of Jerusalem and the temple fundamentally changed Judaism. It also pushed the Jesus movement onto a path that would eventually lead to creating its own scriptures.
A crisis that spurred new religious forms. And those new Christian scriptures, the Gospels and letters, how did they relate to the Hebrew Bible?
Christian writers dove into the Hebrew scriptures, interpreting them, really reinterpreting them as coded prophecies about Jesus. This is where the idea of a suffering Messiah really takes shape, reading passages in ways their original authors likely never intended.
And the Gospels themselves show different perspectives, reflecting the chaos after the temple fell.
Definitely. Mark, likely writing first, emphasizes suffering, the break with Judaism. Matthew tries to show Jesus fulfilling Jewish tradition. Luke focuses on Jew-Gentile unity. John presents Jesus as the Logos, the Word made flesh, echoing maybe some Philonic ideas, but grounding them in a person.
So even within early Christianity, no single view. Meanwhile, what was happening in Rabbinic Judaism after the temple's loss?
They developed midrash, a method of interpretation profoundly shaped by compassion. Think of Hillel's golden rule. What is hateful to yourself, do not do to your fellow. That became the core of Torah.
The rest is commentary, as they say.
Exactly. And the act of interpretation itself became paramount. What is Torah? It is the interpretation of Torah. The Babylonian Talmud, the Bavli, embodies this. It records debates across centuries, often without final answers, inviting continuous engagement. It's like the first interactive text.
The meaning isn't static, it's found in the ongoing conversation. Amazing. How did Christians continue to engage the Hebrew texts as their movement spread?
Well, apologists use prophecy fulfillment arguments to convince pagans, but someone like Origen, a towering figure, saw the entire Old Testament as almost a kind of midrash pointing towards the new. He used allegory extensively to smooth over difficult passages for Christians.
That body, soul, spirit idea, literal, moral, spiritual senses.
That's Origen. He believed the spiritual sense was the deepest, truest meaning. And later, with monasticism, you get Lectio Divina.
Where the personal devotional meaning becomes key, how the text speaks to me right now.
Exactly. Less focus on original intent, more on personal spiritual resonance.
All these different readings must have led to disagreements, though.
Oh, absolutely. Big theological debates, like the Arian controversy about whether Jesus was fully divine or a created being, hinged on different interpretations of key scriptural passages.
And they ended up using words not even the Bible, like homoousion of one substance, to settle these debates.
Right. Showing the limits of scripture alone sometimes. Basil of Caesarea even talked about kerygma, the public biblical teaching, versus dogma, the deeper, ineffable mysteries expressed more through liturgy.
Fascinating. So, moving into the medieval period, how did things shift?
Pope Gregory the Great had a big influence. He saw the human mind as damaged by sin, making God hard to grasp directly, so he really emphasized the spiritual senses of Scripture over the literal.
Though, ironically perhaps, the Crusades were fueled by a very literal reading of taking up the cross.
A stark example of literalism's power. But elsewhere, especially through interaction with Muslim scholars in Spain, Europe rediscovered Aristotle. This sparked a huge intellectual renaissance.
Leading to tension between reason and, well, faith or mysticism.
Yes. You had philosophers like Anselm trying to build rational proofs for God. Others, like Bernard of Clairvaux, warned against relying too much on reason, stressing inner experience.
Some tried to bridge the gap, like the Dominicans.
They did, integrating Aristotelian logic with traditional Lectio Divina, trying to find the spiritual meaning within the literal, historical sense. Jewish thinkers like Maimonides were doing similar things, using allegory to reconcile Aristotle with Scripture. By the way, if you find this kind of deep dive interesting, especially how different frameworks interact with texts, you might want to check out Mindful Moments and our podcasts on YouTube. They explore AI analysis of audiobooks, offering another modern lens on texts.
Okay. And alongside this rationalism, mysticism was also flourishing. Kabbalah.
Yes, Kabbalah emerged as a major force within Judaism. It focused intensely on the inner life of God, the hidden dynamics, using esoteric methods like pardids to interpret scripture. The Zohar became its foundational text. Concepts like Ein Sof, the infinite unknowable Godhead, and the Sephiroth, the divine emanations, were central.
A very different path, focusing on the mystical dimensions hidden within the text. So we have reason, mysticism. What leads towards the Reformation and the bigger shift back towards the literal?
It was gradual. Thinkers like Nicholas of Lyra started emphasizing the plain historical sense again. Then you have Wycliffe in England, later Tyndale, pushing for vernacular translations, wanting ordinary people to read the Bible for themselves.
Taking it out of the hands of just the clergy, setting the stage for Luther.
Exactly. Martin Luther's sola scriptura, scripture alone, was revolutionary. It challenged the church's interpretive authority. His reading was intensely Christ-focused. He saw Christ everywhere in Scripture, creating his own canon within the canon.
And his personal breakthrough came from rereading Romans, understanding God's righteousness not as a demand, but as a gift received through faith.
A transformative experience rooted in Scripture. John Calvin, too, emphasized Scripture's authority, famously calling it divine baby talk, God adapting profound truths for human understanding. But he also respected science and nature as God's first revelation.
So the Reformation profoundly elevates the Bible's status for individuals, but perhaps also narrows the range of acceptable interpretations compared to earlier eras.
In some ways, yes. Then comes the modern era, bringing new challenges. The rise of historical critical scholarship analyzed the Bible like any other ancient text, questioning traditional authorship and dating.
Like Wellhausen's documentary hypothesis about the Pentateuch being woven from different sources.
Right. That, alongside Darwin's theory of evolution, posed huge challenges to literal interpretations, especially of Genesis.
How did religious communities react?
It varied. Initially, maybe surprisingly, the reaction to Darwin wasn't universally hostile. But over time, especially in America, you see the rise of fundamentalism as a direct response, fiercely defending literal interpretation.
And seeing current events as direct fulfillments of prophecy. Schofield's dispensationalism, the rapture.
Exactly, viewing history through a very specific prophetic lens drawn from a literal reading. Meanwhile, Reform Judaism was trying to modernize, to rationalize the faith in light of modernity.
And Orthodox Judaism.
Especially after the trauma of the Holocaust, many Orthodox communities doubled down on tradition, on rigorous Torah study and Yeshivah, as a bulwark against modernity's perceived dangers.
And religious Zionism also takes a literal approach to certain promises.
Yes, interpreting biblical promises about the land of Israel, literally, which has had undeniable political consequences. It really underscores how interpretations aren't just academic exercises, they shape actions and ideologies.
We see the Bible used to support liberation theology and to justify slavery. It becomes, as the source material says, a confusing book in our rational age.
It holds so many possibilities, reflecting centuries of human experience, both noble and, frankly, troubling.
So how do we navigate this complexity today in the 21st century?
Well, some scholars suggest focusing on a canon within a canon, emphasizing the texts that promote compassion and justice, while acknowledging the difficult parts. Maybe seeing the Bible itself as a warning against rigid certainty, whether religious or secular.
And continuing that tradition of midrash, of interpretation, applying its wisdom to our own contemporary problems.
That seems crucial. The conversation has to continue.
So to wrap up, it's clear the Bible story isn't static. It's a history of dynamic, constant reinterpretation, deeply tied to historical moments, cultural shifts, and human needs. Literalism, that's actually a fairly recent trend in the grand scheme of things.
It's been a source of incredible unity and creativity, but also division and conflict. Its meaning is still being negotiated.
Which leaves us with a thought, doesn't it? Given this long, complex history, what's our responsibility as readers today? How do we engage with this text to foster understanding and compassion rather than division?
That's the ongoing challenge.
Definitely something to ponder. Please subscribe to our channel for more explorations like this one. Share this discussion if you found it insightful. And if you want to delve deeper, consider checking out Karen Armstrong's The Bible, a biography. There's a link in the description. Most importantly, keep thinking critically about the powerful texts that shape our world.